Forestville Series, Session Number 4. The development and growth of the village of Forestville and its contributions to the Bristol community. Review of Session Number 3. Session 3 began with the signing of the Treaty of Paris and the Proclamation of 1763, both dealing with a resolution of issues surrounding the conclusion of the French and Indian War on the North American continent and the 7 Years' War in other world areas. Both documents led to resentment and further warring by the Indian nations, the Pontiac Rebellion, and anger by the colonists as they viewed their western movement restricted and their right to self-government being removed. These documents that virtually eliminated French imperialistic power within North America also served as the beginning of the end of British control within the colonies. The British then initiated a series of legislations or enactments that taxed the colonists, attempted to force them into purchasing monopolized British products, and restricted their ability of self-government. The British stated that these were to assist in defraying the military expenditures within the colonies. These included the Navigation Acts, Stamp Act, Sugar Act, Townshend Act, and the Tea Act. When British troops were sent to Boston to quiet the colonists' unrest, 5 civilians were killed by British soldiers in 1770. Samuel Adams and others used this incident as a rallying cry against the British. The discontentment was again shown by the Boston Tea Party in 1773, with Sons of Liberty members dressed as Mohawk Indians in a non-violent demonstration dumped 46 tons of tea into the Boston harbor. King George III, as a retaliatory measure, enacted the coercive acts known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts in 1774. 4 of these laws were directly aimed at the colony of Massachusetts, while the 5th, the Quebec Act, gave massive areas of land from the Great Lakes and Ohio Territory to the Canadians. This was to bring them into alliance with the British should war break out. However, when the War of Independence occurred, the Canadians did not join the British. This series of legislations was directed to bring the colonists into compliance with British rule, but to the contrary, escalated the situation. The cry of taxation without representation is tyranny echoed throughout the colonies. The British had miscalculated and misunderstood the changing sense of values and commitments of self-government that the colonists desired. Mad King George and the British Parliament, through these acts, drove the colonists to the breaking point. On April 19, 1775, on the Lexington Green in Lexington, Massachusetts, the "Shot Heard Round the World" sounded the beginning of the War of Independence. Bristol, like every other community in the colonies, was affected by the War of Independence. Citizens, neighbors, and families were often split and sometimes torn apart by differing views regarding the need for separation. The Episcopalians, loyal to the Church of England, unlike the Congregationalists, did not desire independence from Britain. They were considered traitors to the cause and fearing for their lives, fled to the Chippens Hill area. They did not return to Bristol as a religious group until 1834. The story of local resident Moses Dunbar was also told. He was the only Loyalist or Tory hung in Connecticut for high treason during the War of Independence. The New Cambridge Society felt that it was deserving of town status with independent decision-making. They were joined by the West Briton Society, the future Burlington, in its petition when applying to the State General Assembly. Their request was approved with a merger as the incorporated town of Bristol in 1785. Difficulties arose between the two societies almost immediately. It was decided that the union was too fragile to succeed, and in 1806 West Briton was incorporated as a separate town of Burlington. This is where Session 4 will begin. Military travel during the War of Independence and post-Revolutionary era often proved very difficult over the uneven, steep, and often muddy roads of the mid to late 18th century. Only light loads, not adequate to conduct successful business enterprise, could be transported, traveling only 8 to 10 miles per day. With commercial industry developing, more mobility and improved overland shipping of raw materials, finished products, and people was a necessity if a town was to grow and prosper. It was becoming necessary also to improve transportation systems to accommodate travel by stagecoaches and teamster wagons. Fortunately, state leaders recognized the need for improved major and secondary roads leading to communities such as Bristol in order to continue their economic growth. Private turnpike companies were chartered to complete the construction. They were permitted to erect toll gates or barriers along their route in order to charge a fee or toll to recuperate their expenditures. Churchgoers, military personnel, and citizens traveling to town meetings or voting sessions were exempt. Farmers traveling between fields or to grist mills were also toll-free. 2 companies were hired in 1795 to construct a highway from Hartford to Litchfield through the West Briton area. This was completed in 1805 and closely resembled today's Route 4. This was known as the Hartford-Albany Turnpike. The legislature authorized a second turnpike in the Bristol area. This was originally designated as being a second highway in the West Briton section of Bristol. A delegation, including George Mitchell and Elisha Manross, pointed out that 4/5 of Bristol's population lived south of the proposed plan. They said a different location would better serve the community. Their concept garnered support, and in 1803, plans were developed for a turnpike south of the West Briton area. This would become known as the Middle Road Turnpike, running through the center of town, approximately today's Route 6. This route, used by stage lines and teamsters bringing heavy freight to Bristol, connected Hartford and Danbury and points further in both directions. It served as a direct route for goods to be brought to stores operated by Mitchell and Manross, establishing the original center of Bristol at today's North End. West Briton had strongly objected to the location change and when a special taxes was levied for the new turnpike in the former New Cambridge area, this added fuel to the fire in an already contentious relationship. This became a major incident in the movement for the separation of Burlington from Bristol in 1806. In 1820, the partially completed Erie Canal in northern New York proved that overland water transportation could provide a more rapid mode to ship raw materials, finished products, and people. Beginning in 1821, conversations were initiated regarding the construction of an overland canal system within Connecticut. The Farmington Canal Company was chartered in 1822 to construct a waterway from the Massachusetts-Connecticut state line to the seaport of New Haven. In 1823, the Hampshire and Hampton Canal Company was engaged by the Massachusetts legislature to construct a system that would connect with the Farmington Canal at the state border. This would expand shipping from the north, with plans developed to continue it even further north. This became known as the Northampton Canal. This was an extraordinary engineering feat. 86 miles of land, 56 in Connecticut and 30 in Massachusetts, needed to be purchased, cleared by pick and shovel, canals excavated, bridges and locks constructed, and movement planned going both north and south simultaneously, utilizing only the one canal. The boats would be tied to a team of 3 or more horses or mules that would move along a towpath at approximately 5 or 6 miles per hour. When necessary, the boat would be maneuvered into a lock. Water would be pumped in, raising the boat to a higher level before continuing its journey. There was a series of 28 locks in Connecticut, raising the boats approximately 292 feet above sea level in New Haven. The typical canal boat was 50 to 75 feet in length, 8 to 10 feet wide, and approximately 4 feet deep with a flat bottom. Benjamin Wright, the chief engineer for the Erie Canal, was contracted to create the design and oversee the project. The Farmington Canal passed through the Great Plain, later Plainville, which had 2 areas known as the Bristol Basin, which became the center of Plainville, and Whiting Basin. Each had warehouses and dry goods docks for loading and unloading of raw materials and finished products. The first canal boat reached this area in 1828. The entire canal project was completed in 1835. The Turnpike Error proved extremely beneficial to the canal system. Tinware, clock parts, finished clocks, farm produce, and all kinds of products could easily reach the Bristol Basin from Plymouth, the Litchfield area, Bristol, and Forestville after its founding in 1833. The village's close proximity to the basin expedited movement and reduced costs as its wares could easily reach New Haven and be shipped around the world. The advent of the Canal Error throughout Connecticut changed the economic, social, religious, and educational circles. Faster packet boats, which were often highly decorated and colored red, yellow, and green, were developed for passenger travel and excursions, oftentimes being utilized for honeymoon travel. and even for floating religious services. Unfortunately, the canal system was, from the beginning, in constant financial difficulties. The creation of the New Haven Railroad in 1838 omened the demise of this system. The two companies merged as the New Haven and Northampton Company. These canal stockholders, as their only financial salvation, in 1845 and 46, petitioned the General Assembly that they be permitted to utilize their canal beds for laying of railroad tracks. The canal system closed in 1847. By 1848, the New Haven Railroad reached Plainville, and 2 years later would continue on to Waterbury, passing through Forestville and Bristol. The canal system only survived a quarter of a century, but its impact on the growth of interior Connecticut, especially the Bristol-Forestville area, was significant. Today, many of the remnants of this extraordinary engineering accomplishment still exist. They are utilized as bicycle and walking trails or paths, labeled with historic markers, and several individual pieces are registered on the National Registry of Historic Places. In 1985, the entire Connecticut route from Suffield to New Haven was placed on the National Registry. The Plainville Historic Center has an outstanding display depicting this historic canal, and also gives extraordinary programs regarding its development and utilization. For nearly a century after the settlement by Ebenezer Barnes in 1728, very little growth occurred in this area. During the late 1700s and the early decades of the 19th century, supported by the turnpike and canal system, there was an unprecedented development. The community was beginning to transition from a self-sufficient farming lifestyle to an emerging industrial existence. Since the American Revolution, citizens were more conscious of the outside world, with deepening of intellectual learning, utilizing newspapers like the weekly Hartford Current and geographies to supplement their religious readings. Puritanical or congregational thinking was beginning to be replaced by freedom of choice, humanistic actions, and belief in a forgiving God and universal salvation. Religious diversification and a more secular lifestyle was occurring. 3 religions within Bristol had sizable minorities and resented the legally established privilege and authority of the Congregational Church. The Congregationalists, perceiving that their days as the established church were numbered, railed against presidential candidate Thomas Jefferson during the election of 1800, knowing that he believed in the concept of the separation of church and state. This included the preaching at Bristol's Congregational Church by Pastor Giles Coles. Jefferson was elected to the presidency. A statewide movement, including delegates from the community's 3 minority religions, petitioned the state assembly to end the Congregationalist special status. The Connecticut State Constitution of 1810 ended the concept of an established church by stating, "No preference shall be given by law to any Christian sect or mode of worship." Merchant George Mitchell served as Bristol's delegate to the State Constitutional Convention, which prepared a document in 1818 finalizing the Congregational Church's disestablishment. The Baptists within the community had built a small church at the west end in 1802 and later moved to its present location. In 1834, the Methodists established a church on West Street, and the Episcopalian religion returned to Bristol, constructing the Trinity Church at the corner of Maple and Summer Streets. Each of these religions now shared equally within Bristol with the Congregational Church and would later influence the religious development of Forestville. Between 1837 and 1861, prior to the war between the states, there were divided sentiments regarding slavery. This is generally considered a Southern issue in the annals of history, but to the contrary, slavery existed by law in Connecticut and Bristol in a mild form until 1848. The numbers of slaves had always been small, and they did not play an important part of either the industrial or social life within the community. Slaves, although considered as a commodity, were generally treated better than their southern plantation counterparts, but were not permitted to vote or hold public office. Wealthy farmers of Farmington and New Cambridge, later Bristol, generally owned slaves. Reverend Samuel Newell, first pastor of the Congregational Church, kept a young black woman as a household servant, and William Jerome, the wealthiest man in town at the time, owned 2 slaves. One, Job, a 14-year-old boy, was sold to him by Pastor Newell. Some of the earliest wealth in Connecticut came by way of slave trading from the West Indies. 100 sea captains from Middletown engaged in this form of commerce. From one arriving ship, 115 slaves were auctioned off within that community. Some things, like business, never change. Elisha N. Welch, a prominent clockmaker from Forestville, was a copperhead during the Civil War. This means he supported the Southern slavery and advocated against the war. He was afraid that the war would interrupt or destroy his lucrative clock marketing in the South. Importation of slaves was prohibited by law in 1774, but clandestinely continued until the Civil War. The first signs of an anti-slavery movement in Bristol was a state gathering at the Congregational Church's meeting house in 1838. Reverend Leverett Griggs, congregational pastor during the Civil War, delivered his stirring anti-slavery address, Fugitives from Slavery, from the church's pulpit. He became a strong friend of Reverend Michael Rodden of St. Joseph's Church. Together, after the war, they assisted in bringing harmony and feelings of personal dignity back to the community. Yes, times, circumstances, and outlooks were changing within the community. Let's now look at its emerging industrialization. Early signs of the Industrial Revolution were becoming apparent from 1800 through 1840, with the emergence of the first rudimentary commercial enterprise in the Bristol area beginning at the end of the 18th century. This was the sale of potash, a fertilizer made from wood ash. This was the first product utilized for trading purposes extending beyond local boundaries. The winds of change were swirling within the community as it was transitioning from an at-home, subsistence, self-sustaining farming lifestyle to a more mobile, out-of-the-home, mechanized, machine-driven, wage labor relationships located within small shops or factory settings. Social structures, economic patterns, the role of the family, educational opportunity, transportation requirements, and community resources would need to accommodate, change, or be adopted to sustain the growing nature of the town. Even more important than the sale of potash was the production of tinware that led directly to our community's involvement in clock distribution throughout the country and also internationally. Utilizing hand tools, vessels, and tableware such as cups, canisters, kitchen utensils, and other necessities were crafted in small shops from plated iron sheets purchased from Britain. This industry began prior to the War of Independence and prospered from 1790 to 1810, largely due to the construction of turnpikes. This became a winter cottage industry at home with the entire family engaged. Artistically talented individuals would often paint ornamental designs on these items. Tin peddlers were the pioneer salesmen in the area, first traveling on foot or by horseback, and later by covered wagon with teams of horses. By 1800, their extensive and well-organized routes oftentimes exceeded 1,500 miles across the country. Peddlers recognized the needs and desires of their customers, which also yielded them better profits than selling only tinware. They carried pens, books, combs, buttons, and other cheap fancies. They eventually aligned themselves with storekeepers and manufacturers who generally control the town's credit and money system, but who were also dependent on the profits brought back by these peddlers. These profits would be utilized to satisfy debt and also to reinvest in future industrial expansion. The manufacturers, storekeepers, businesses, and peddlers were closely intertwined and depended on each other for the town's economic growth. 11 tinners were located in Bristol in 1804 at the height of production. By 1810, only 5 tinsmiths existed within the community. This occupation would soon pass out of existence. Most tin peddlers transitioned to the sales of clocks, which was more profitable utilizing the well-organized routes. This facilitated the emergence and success of the clock industry. Bristol would be tied into state and national markets and soon would be engaged with international commerce. Clockmaking became Bristol's major industry during the last decade of the 18th century. For approximately 100 years, it was the only industry unless offshoot enterprises were developed by clockmakers. Clockmaking continued for over a century and one half in our community. Early clockmakers were not manufacturers, but rather can be described as handicraft artisans or mechanics who could perform all aspects of clockmaking. Connecticut, in the early stages, generally worked with wooden movements made by hand. A cabinet joiner or maker who made household furniture would be engaged to make the cabinets to house the clock movements. Owners generally worked side by side with their employees. The clocks were expensive and sold only to the wealthy because of the time and effort required in production. Gideon Roberts was Bristol's first clockmaker, starting in 1798. Utilizing traditional hand methods, he constructed wooden gears and later marketed his clocks, traveling as far as Pennsylvania. His shop was located on Wolcott Street. Roberts has oftentimes been inaccurately credited with being the first clockmaker in the United States. Accurate history indicates that many people were involved in this endeavor even prior to his birth. Roberts, however, was a pioneer in mass production techniques, but never received appropriate recognition. Mass production techniques transformed the clock industry during the first third of the 19th century. Utilizing machinery and a transition from wooden to brass gears, clocks became smaller, less expensive, and more accurate. Previous heavy weights that provided the winding element and pendulums that regulated the time were replaced by spring movements produced by Bristol industries such as the Wallace Barnes and Dunbar companies. Clockmaking as an industry changed to factory production that needed less skilled labor, relying mainly on assemblers. Cabinet makers were still essential, designing elaborate cases to remain competitive in clock marketing. The factories, because of the machinery used, needed to be located on rivers where dams and falling water could provide the power. Buying water privileges on the limited rivers was essential, and only a certain number of factories could exist because of the distance needed between them. Shops that could not adjust to the switch from wood to brass, or who could not afford to relocate to river sites, soon closed. Although Eli Terry is extremely important to the history of clockmaking in Plymouth and Terryville, a town named after him, he also contributed significantly to Bristol's successful entry into the clock industry. Utilizing mass production of wooden gears at his Terryville factory, he manufactured a small shelf clock. This revolutionized the clock industry and, for a short period of time, created a monopoly of this production by Terry. Clockmaking came to a complete stop in Bristol in 1820, with production passing back to the Plymouth area. Chauncey Jerome, who was employed by Terry for several months, moved to Bristol in 1821, reviving the community's clockmaking production. He, as well as Elias Ingram, a well-known cabinet maker, were recruited by local merchant George Mitchell. Ingram became so successful that he established his own clock shop in 1835, which continued through his descendants until 1967, when it was bought out by the McGraw-Edison Company, which continued making electric clocks utilizing the Ingram trademark. Jerome, utilizing mass production techniques, produced clock cases, adapting his design from that of the Terry pillar and scroll shelf clock design. He purchased and assembled the clock mechanisms used in his clocks. Jerome's enthusiasm within the clock industry provided the impetus within the community from 1821 through 1837 for the opening of 40 shops that manufactured clock or clock parts. In 1824, he went into business with his brother Noble and Elijah Darrow, continuing the successful shelf clock production, utilizing a variety of designs. The years from around 1820 to 1837 was a period when the American dream as a land of opportunity, especially in Bristol, made possible for employees without land to rise through the ranks, acquiring sufficient skills and finances to become a master of their own business. By 1830, Bristol's population was rapidly increasing with the influx of experienced clockmakers, clock painters, and workers from many different communities. Jerome's shop stood near where the American Silver Company stood at the north side of the intersection of today's Main Street and Memorial Boulevard, neither that existed at that time. In 1826, he petitioned that the town build a bridge over the Pequawpik River as well as a road leading to his factory. When the town refused, he offered to pay for the bridge construction and half the cost of the land required for the road. The town graciously accepted the arrangement, which led to the development of today's Main Street. Jerome's business acumen was demonstrated when Southern legislators imposed a tariff on imported Northern clocks. He quickly opened a Richmond, Virginia factory and shipped manufactured parts as well as employees to this facility. They assembled the clocks there and sold them as Southern clocks, thereby avoiding the taxation and disruption of business. The financing of clock distribution by peddlers was conducted by two successful merchants or storekeepers, George Mitchell from the north side and Thomas Barnes Jr. from the South Village. Originally partners, they later engaged in separate businesses. Mitchell and Barnes, serving like bankers, would purchase from local farmers and artisans and equip the peddlers with supplies and credit for their distant journeys. Peddlers often sold Bristol clocks to the wealthy Southern plantation owners, bringing back the profit to their backers to pay their debts and to reinvest in future purchasing and industrial development. They were highly dependent on this investment return to support their businesses as well as community development. Clock distribution from Bristol would have been much slower without their involvement. There were very few genuine banks, and those that existed had little cash to support their lending. There was little or no national regulation of the banking industry. Most were considered wildcat institutions. All that was necessary to conduct business was a printing press to issue unsupported notes or script. A local example of this were the banknotes issued by Lot Newell, a man of poor reputation and grandson of the first Congregational Church pastor. He issued notes from the president and directors of the Manufacturing Exchange Company of New York City. Unfortunately, this bank never existed, and from the beginning, these notes were worthless pieces of paper that people relied on as valid money. The credit system was trusted until 1837, when an overextension of credit throughout the country forced many banks to reduce or eliminate business accommodations. Many banks closed during this period. Similar to what our country has recently experienced in the last decade, business enterprises and finances were deeply undermined. Peddlers returned to Bristol with completely worthless banknotes. An economic downturn known as the Panic of 1837 throughout the country forced business paralysis and failures. Two-thirds of our community clockmakers went bankrupt, with the other one-third barely surviving. Financier George Mitchell went bankrupt, while Barnes weathered the storm. George Mitchell's name, despite all he contributed to the growth of Bristol, appears to be lost in history, while the Barnes family continues to contribute to the community. Chauncey Jerome survived the panic by securing a mortgage on his property. During the slow times of 1837, he, along with his brother Noble, began planning for the use of brass gears cut by machinery that could simultaneously make many exact duplicate parts. This mass production technique afforded the opportunity for smaller, less expensive clocks, as well as replacing wooden gears that warped in moist atmospheres and when being transported by water. Any factory that failed to make this transition would ultimately close. He would secure his brass from the foundries of the Naugatuck Valley. Jerome became the first from our community to export his one-day clock to England. Challenged by British prejudice and a strict protectionism policy that protected their own clock-making production, he at first found sales very difficult. Once British citizens recognized the beauty, accuracy, and inexpensive nature of his product, lucrative profits were derived. Worldwide distribution of clocks from Bristol was the result. His business enterprise was so successful that in 1843 he added two much larger buildings to his Main Street facility, as well as establishing a case shop in New Haven. Disaster struck our community in 1845. On April 23rd, a raging fire burnt all of his buildings, 50 to 70,000 clock parts, and all of his expensive production machinery. He moved his entire operation to his New Haven facility, eventually naming it the New Haven Clock Company. 3 other local companies were also destroyed by fire the same year. The need for local fire protection and other community resources to respond to the changing complexion of the community was apparent. In 1853, the first fire company was established on School Street. Prior to the Panic of 1837, clockmakers were beginning to see the dangers of the financial system and need to diversify production into other areas in order to succeed. Serving as an example, earlier that year, a dozen leading clockmakers formed the Bristol Manufacturing Company on Riverside Avenue, then known as Water Street. This company manufactured knitted woolen cloth and men's knit underwear. This was the largest factory in town and included employee housing. This was an attempt to shelter some of their assets. Today, the Carousel Museum of New England utilizes part of this building. There were other smaller but similar attempts to avoid financial disaster. After the Panic of 1837, Bristol, as well as other communities, saw the need for improved financial systems, national banking regulations, and diversification in production. Unfortunately, the country did not react appropriately, and 20 years later, in 1857, communities would once again suffer a similar fate. Before beginning the history of clockmaking in the Forestville area, it is necessary to mention Elisha N. Welch, who will be discussed later in this presentation. He played an extraordinary role both in the history of clockmaking and the development of Forestville. The first clockmaking activity in the area that would eventually become Forestville began around 1811. Widely spread throughout the town, these shops would continually move to the south and east toward the eventual center of Forestville. Chauncey Boardman, one of the village's first clockmakers, along with Butler Dunbar, established a small shop at the south end of Stafford Avenue in 1811. This would become the eventual site of the Humison Manufacturing Company. In 1821, along with Joseph Wells, Boardman established another shop near the Turnpike, today's Farmington Avenue. He utilized power from the Copper Mine Brook for production. This was an active area of town known as the Stafford District and had already established a small school there in 1764. The shop eventually rivaled Chauncey Jerome in production, being the second largest clockmaking facility in the community. His shop was located near the present Boardman Street, which is named after him. Elisha Manross, a descendant of Nehemiah Manross, one of the first settlers in town, returned to the community after serving in the War of 1812. Soon after, he bought the former Joseph Ives factory at the corner of Fredericks and West Washington Street and began clock production. He and his sons developed a jewel-bearing mechanism for his clocks. This was the first use of jewels within the country. In 1845, after the village of Forestville was established, he moved closer to its center, building a shop at the bend of Church Avenue, probably where the Forestville Firehouse now stands. He had an extensive business going until his death in 1856. Later purchased by Elijah Welch, this factory burnt to the ground in 1870. Welch purchased the business of Solomon C. Spring on East Street in Bristol, eventually moving it to Forestville. A new company was formed in the valley behind the firehouse near the railroad tracks and became known as the Welch, Spring and Company. Benjamin B. Lewis, a mechanical genius, was the longtime foreman of this company. He patented a clock that showed the time, day, month, and phases of the moon. This was an extraordinary accomplishment at this time. Joseph Ives, known as Uncle Joe Ives because of his affable nature, was probably the greatest inventive clock genius in Bristol and also the New York area. He briefly opened a shop at the corner of Frederick and West Washington Streets, which he later sold to Elijah Manross. In 1818, back in the Bristol area, He experimented with a combination of iron and brass mechanisms, but these clocks proved too cumbersome and required large casings. This did not prove to be a successful venture, but omened the future use of brass. Ives himself was not truly a successful clockmaker, but enjoyed his endeavors and contributed significantly to the future development of the industry. Samuel Terry, brother of Eli Terry, bought the former Down grist mill in 1828 and converted it into a clock shop. He brought the Terry family business, including mass production techniques, to the village area and closer to shipping by the Farmington Canal. He stayed in production until 1835, withdrawing at that time because of the emerging cutthroat nature of the business just prior to the Panic of 1837. LaPorte Hubble, who lived on Washington Street, conducted a clock business at the north end of Frederick Street. Part of the dam utilized for his business can still be seen today. He produced marine clocks to be utilized on ships, as well as, at one time, self-winding clocks. Keeping accurate time on board swaying ships had always been difficult, but he was able to successfully address this issue and establish a successful business. The founding of the village of Forestville. Jonathan C. Brown, William G. Bartholomew, and William Hills of Farmington, all former cabinet makers, joined a partnership in 1833 and purchased land in the eastern part of Bristol in the unbroken forest on the Pequabic River. Being further east than any other clockmakers, they were able to secure water privileges to construct a dam and build a water wheel to power their clockmaking factory. The location was where the Sessions Clock Company stood on East Main Street. They were so far east on the Pequabic River that they would not impinge on the already established businesses. Another advantage of this location was their proximity to the Farmington Canal's Bristol Basin, which would become the Plainville Center. They could easily transport their clocks via Pine Street. This was an advantage over their Bristol counterparts. This really was the true beginning of Forestville, the village in the forest. A bridge was built across the Pequabic River, joining the northern and southern parts of the community, each which had scattered homes. A road was built leading to the factory and beyond. Originally, the street was known as Mud Row because of its wet terrain. Later, it was named Main Street and finally changed to East Main Street. A community started to develop as small employee houses, similar to hen coops, were constructed near the factory. The original area was called Hen Coop Alley, which was later renamed Lincoln Avenue. A substantial investment for this factory had been made with the purchase of 15 acres, the construction of 3 large buildings, and the implementation of the best production machinery available. The firm was known as the Forestville Manufacturing Company and began production of brass clocks in 1835. When the Chauncey Jerome's factory moved to New Haven in 1845 after the disastrous fire, the Forestville Manufacturing Company became the largest clock-making factory in the community. It was producing over 100,000 finished clocks per year. Unfortunately, like many other factories within the community, it experienced a devastating fire in 1853. Attempts to reorganize and rebuild began, but during the panic of 1857, the Forestville Manufacturing Company went bankrupt. Elisha N. Welch is luckily forced onto the scene. He was a remarkable industrial genius in organizing, multitasking, and managing business affairs. He, more than any other community figure, was responsible for managing affairs within the village. His brother Harmenis was a New Haven manufacturer and banker and assisted Elisha financially, which brought back stability to the former Forestville Manufacturing Company. Welch was the largest creditor of the Forestville Manufacturing Company and was forced to buy the company because it was in so much debt to the Bristol Brass and Clock Company. Welch also was director of the brass organization, which would have gone into bankruptcy had Welch not been able to pay off the debt. He immediately took over the company and later incorporated it in 1864 as the E.N. Welch Clock Company. For over 20 years, it was highly successful within the clock industry. He experienced health issues for over 2 years and died in 1887, leaving an estate of over $2 million. James Hart Welch, his son, took over the company, which was beginning to show signs of decline. He had neither the business genius of his father nor the ambition to sustain the business. It appears that he had more interest in farming at his home, known as the Oaks, and also spent considerable time vacationing. His home was located where the former St. Matthew Convent was situated. In 1899, the demise of this company, like many others, came by way of a disastrous fire. James Hart Welch died in 1902. The Sessions family of Bristol, who held the controlling stock interest, purchased the company and renamed it the Sessions Clock Company in 1903. William E. Sessions, who lived in a home called Belle Eden, became president, while Albert L. Sessions, who lived in the Wedding Cake House, now the DuPont Funeral Home, became treasurer. Both homes were located on Bellevue Avenue. Session number 5 will continue with the further industrial development, the coming of the railroad, the role of immigrants, and other areas important to the continued development of the village.